So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the second tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage, the true prophets of old, the prophets where then the Messiah himself made reference of, and also the Creator himself spoke through. So then, how can we define then precisely what's coming in the future? There are certain areas of the Israelic lineage where then we find layer upon layer. Some of the people, when they read, they understand precept upon precept, line upon line. Those, they do not exist. What does exist is layerings or layers of understanding. So then, when we begin our quest understanding the time of restoration of the holy cities, known as tabernacling, amazingly, from the Greco translation of the Galah, we find then, miraculously, the Greco translation, when making a reference of tabernacling, it is absolutely precise. Sometimes we wonder how they would know tabernacling, the very word, because in Hebrew yet is ciphered as ushkini, yet they understand the concept, and then it was translated properly. So then, the point is, what would be the market in the future? When we study, for instance, Daniel the prophet, the second chapter, we understand it as a basic layout of a project. So when you do have an idea in mind, then you write the basics of the idea. In order to make it not overwhelming, a person simply writes the most important topics. As you then begin to think through each of those topics, then you subdivide those topics in more topics, then you can make further development of your ideas. At least this would be the normal. It is very unusual finding a person with many details of each of those topics and writing them down precisely, then as a first topic, then the first subtopic, and sometimes a subtopic of the subtopic, and then going from A to Z, doing the entire work. It simply is not normal. But then when we have a sketch of the idea, then we developed other areas. So then when we read layered, we find that Daniel the second chapter explains the statue. So then the statue is the rough sketch. Then it has to have a sub idea or sub explanation of the main subject. You find then in the 12th chapter areas of the later days, or then the time of the end. Then the chapter 11, we have to understand that there is a time of restoration prior of autumn feast. When we read the second chapter, and then the rock that came from heaven and destroyed the statue explains tabernacling then as the Messiah himself then returning for the gathering of his people. So then, second chapter, base of the statue. Then, the statue itself is a sketch. But you do understand where then you find Yeshayahu the prophet explaining of the base of the statue. 61st chapter. Then you find Ezekiel the prophet in another time then explaining the same topic. And then you find Galah. How do we find, for instance, the time of restoration? Time of restoration, Yeshayahu 61st chapter. And the cities laid waste for many centuries. You read Ezekiel 38:5, speaks of the land of Cush, time of restoration, then devastation. But you have to read then the translation in Hebrew. If you read in English, then the layering does not get lined up. When you read in Hebrew, from the right to the left, sometimes your mind can't make any sense out of it. But then, because you are not trained in finding those areas where then other prophets are given the answer. So you don't read only Daniel thinking it's Daniel. It's not Daniel tabernacling. When you have your mind fixed in tabernacling, what do you understand? The prophets have always the same understanding every time. It is always consistent. So Yirmiyahu had to speak of tabernacling in a certain fashion. Yirmiyahu had to speak of tabernacling in the same fashion. Daniel spoke of tabernacling of the same fashion. Ezekiel spoke of the tabernacling of the same fashion. It never changes. So we find in Yirmiyahu the prophet explaining of the time of the completion of the spring feast. We find in the time of transition from the first and second tabernacle services. We find in the 1,000 years of the Messiah, the 1,000 years of Nahashatan, speaking of tabernacling is concerned. But then you have the 2,000 years when the Messiah spent with the Samaritans, 2 Yom creation days. Then we find the limit of the prophecy in 70:32. So then when we read Daniel, what is he explaining? Then the base of the statue, iron and clay, they do not mix. What did he say? Then nations would try, kingdoms, they would try to come together and they would not adhere to each other. What do we understand of the system? Where do we find the first beast? In Europe. That's what we read in Galah, don't we? And then Yohanan. Yohanan is giving the understanding and writing what the Messiah is saying. Because the Messiah is showing him, and he was writing. So then, what went on? The first beast, and then he saw the second beast. First beast as it was then the ocean. Ocean represents people. Then he saw then the beast coming out of the earth. Then the second beast. So then, when Daniel the prophet was explaining of those areas of the time of the end, we find then nations being together as they trying to adhere to each other under a system where rather than having iron and clay, they want to make everybody iron. What do we find of the Eurozone? Eurozone is precisely what then Daniel the prophet is explaining. They would try to come together under a system, but they would not adhere to each other. And then he explains later then the divisions of the kingdoms. No, of course, you have to layer the understanding of Daniel, and then the system is spoke of by then the Messiah, chapter 1:8 of Galah. He's explaining there is then the freighters coming and becoming in charge. He did not say kingdoms or then governments. He said freighters. So in order for the freighters to be in charge, we have to get rid of governments. There are steps of formation where absolutely each understanding must fit with the scripture. So then, how would you have only freighters in charge and non-governments? The Messiah already gave the answer. But the problem is, we are not layering them. We were never trained. We have to layer understanding upon understanding and understanding and understanding, because we are dealing with the perfection of the Creator as times and generations. We must have precisely the same stable, continuous, relevant information from generation, 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 and generation. So then when your kids are born, they understand the same layer of understanding where then people from the past had the same understanding. Never changes. It does not mean it has no technology. Technology moves on, but we are speaking of tabernacling. We can't mix tabernacling with the world's layer. That's why then the Creator very wisely, he decided to have king is king, prophet is prophet. So those layers, they don't get mixed up. During the time of the seed, came out then the scandalized scripture, where then both layers were then scandalized. They were mixed up. It doesn't work. So then we find the freighters in charge, and what makes freighters then in charge? Having authority regarding the layer of Gentiles. You have to get rid of governments. But not get rid of governments via war. It's via a system. You get rid of the governments via a system where then they are caught unawares because they are not charging taxes. Without taxes, the government halts. I don't care if you have 10 printing machines. I don't care if your money then is worldwide then famous. It comes a time where paper money and production, they no longer match, then the system halts. And then when the system becomes available, we understand it comes from the Pacific. Chinese system is coming very strongly via the Pacific, but we on the other side of the world, we are absolutely oblivious. And then Shaliach Shaul say they would believe fables. Crazy understandings of a Messiah outside of tabernacling, and it doesn't exist. That's why then Shaliach Shaul was so strong regarding, at the end of times, they would believe these strange Messiah with crazy ideas. It did not come from us, the set apart. We always taught for centuries. Layers of understanding, tabernacling. Then the Creator coming first, tenting, or then tabernacling. Then later, for 1,000 years, they were trained. Then the Messiah came, continue on with tabernacling. And then tabernacling for another 1,000 years. So the earth has more time tabernacling than any other time. And then we are returning to this tabernacling, but people are oblivious because they are mixed up the layer of heaven, tabernacling, and the earth for Gentile level. The Messiah, when he was speaking chapter 1:8 of Galah, he was explaining of freighters of the earth, the Gentile level. Governments were out. And the governments are going to be out. Freighters of the earth are going to be in charge. The only point a person can have a government if they are charging taxes. But then what has the Messiah said? When he was then placed in a position of listening from governments and tabernacling. The people of the law were there, and also the Roman authorities were there. And the Messiah was asked, should we pay taxes? He was thrown in a situation where then if he said A, then he was going to be caught for saying A. If he would say B, he would be caught for saying B. And the Messiah said, simply, give me a coin. What face is there in a coin? Caesar. Pay your taxes. Give it to Caesar what's Caesar, and God God's. He was saying, pay your taxes. But then, as we understand, it was not only a simple option, it was an order. Came straight from heaven. Reason? Because the Messiah knew in the future governments would scandalize themselves so badly. The very normal factor of life of 6 days you should work, a day should rest. Governments are so lazy these days. They don't want to work. They want to get up in the morning as if they are gods or kings or some sort of a title. They want to enjoy the day, having breakfast in the morning, government pays for, picks them up in the morning, government pays for, and then credit card of the government, everywhere they go lunching, having fun. So there is no delineation of being working versus then having a time for vacation. And the governments are so much scandalized with this, and then the Messiah is explaining the freighters are going to be in charge because the governments have done a very bad job for more than 1,000 years. That's why we find the Messiah explained, and the freighters of the earth. Governments are going to be secondary. And then if they don't charge tax properly, as the Messiah said, give it to the government, belongs to the government. Give it to Caesar what's Caesar's. He was explaining then government, and they should be paid. So it is the obligation of every country charging tax instantly, prior of the coming of the system. Because when it comes, it is absolutely overwhelming. And then there won't be time for taking your time. You know, politicians, they are so scoundrel. They take their time. They go together over there after a nice breakfast. And then some of them fart. And then they talk to each other. Then, you know, they smoke. And they come together to talk about it. And then they talk of 10 minutes maybe of true work. And then time for break. And they talk around. And, you know, talking golfing. And the work doesn't get done. And the Creator watching these every day, you know, comes a time where they say no more of these. The freighters are going to be in charge. If the governments, they don't charge taxes, as then the Messiah told them, they're going to be out of the game. Because a government can't function without taxes. How is it going to be then the market? Well, you can understand it very plainly. When the system comes, you download in your computer, and the world is changing then overnight. There won't be time for thinking through areas and thinking through, you know, developments, and you kind of a targeted area over there where there is a mine. Then you try to work it through some sort of a smart grid and some sort of environmental protection type of project where to get many people certified, you know, to work the land, make sure there is environmental impact done, and blah blah blah. There won't have any more this time. Because the excitement of the moment of having this downloading in a computer, then you take your funding from your bank, you transfer to the system, you find a number over there, and then you have a list of items where you can invest and you can purchase and you can receive at home at no charge of tax. There won't have any more time for the luxury of making plans because the excitement of the moment is so big. Governments are going to be extremely overwhelmed. Speaking of then parcels, freighters, and then ships coming through, trucks, they won't be able to handle the demand. And then they find each country, their bankings, their savings wiped out because people are going to invest in the system. And they can't observe what's in there. How much do you have there? 12 digits? It's none of your nose. You stick your nose where you belong. The government. Have you charged taxes? No. Take a hike. And I want my parcel. So there won't have any more time of this luxury of, you know, get up in the morning, get in the car, you know, there is a breakfast waiting over there. You don't have to pay for gas to go to work and the such. These people are out of job. The Messiah said, and the freighters of the earth. People in charge, the freighters. Because overnight the world is going to change. And then the smart governments, they stock up, for instance, with heavy-duty machinery, transportation, trucks, simple, easy fixing, part interchangeable, such as the Soviets. They build robust, simple, and serviceable. Then you have a stockpile of crude. A huge tank in the ground with lots of crude. Mining equipment, roading equipment. You find in ships. And you stock up with those. When the time comes, and then you have the Amazon and most importantly, the African continent, then you begin to understand what then Daniel was trying to explain. You find the kingdom of the north, the kingdom of the south. And then you also find areas where the people of the east, there you find China, you find then Soviet Union, then you find amazingly Africa. Africa is rich. Was it not the kingdom of Cush then that conquered Egypt? Do you understand how big they were in the past? And then you find huge amounts of ores and coltan. A lot of people in the world don't even know what coltan is. And it's more precious than gold. And they have 80% of the world's deposits. And then you find a relationship, then the kingdom of the South Africa, trying to make a relationship with then the kingdom of the North, then the Soviet Union. And then you find the East, the Chinese. And then you find tabernacling and the relationship with the entire situation. But then it's changing overnight. When the time comes, they won't have the luxury anymore of having plans. It's going to be such as the American frontier. The land is there, you have to be there, but then do you have shovels? Do you have then what takes the equipment to do, for instance, mining? Do you know that during the California gold rush, sometimes the miners, they were not the richest. It was the person providing shovels and the equipment to do the work. And then the minimum the governments can do is to charge taxes. But then each parcel coming to each country, by the time there is a freight label, must be described and properly taxed per item, per box, or per units. Otherwise, they won't be able to have a record in the future. But then the excitement of the moment and the demand is going to be very real. And they are going to get extremely overwhelmed. We can't track this. It's late. People, they want their parcels and they are screaming around. Because then you have to understand this. Mining companies, while they're going to do their work, freighters going to do their work, they want roads, decent roads, so they can drive and deliver the parcels. A great deal of their own expenses and their own repairs and maintenance of what they have is going to come through the system. It must be delivered. Then the government gets that, that animal that is found on the road, at night when it gets the high beam on the face. And then they say, we are overwhelmed. I'm give a damn if I'm overwhelmed. I want my parcel. And they have to deal with it. But then they find themselves extremely overwhelmed, and they can't do what the demand is demanding them to do, because they did not prepare themselves. So it's not the lack of equipment, it's not the lack of plan, it's the lack of time. It's going to have, for instance, 10 mining companies competing, for instance, for a section of the world where then they have to have a plan instantly. Some of the governments, they have to be so on top. If they would charge tax 100% of every parcel that comes to the country, every container, counted for. If they make a deal with the freighter companies, where then every time there is then the scan of the label, taxes are already deducted. Then they would have to work very closely with those mining companies trying to get a hold of the land over there to do mining. Then the government has to very fast, extremely fast, because it must have a road over there. From there has to have a fuel depot. From there they're going to have houses and people. They want their parcels. They won't have any more time. People are already moving to the area over there with their computers and their generators, and they are ordering online. Has to have a road. And then when they order from China, they are not interested if there is a road over there in the midst of the forest in somebody else's country. They have their product purchased. They want out of the country. The rest, they have to deal with it. That's how the governments are going to be out of the game. Because they did not prepare themselves. The Messiah never made a mistake. So if you think you have a higher plan than these, then the only situation left is has the Creator change his mind. You would be out of your mind if you think the Creator would change his mind, because he said he changes not. So then when you compare yourself with the Creator, either of you, or both of you, or one of you would be wrong. The Creator is never wrong. So then you are wrong. The Messiah said, freighters of the earth, they are in charge. So if governments want a share of the movement, very fast motion of the future, you know, that very excitement of the motion of the moment, where you can make decisions, and then your decisions can contribute in line of what the freighters want. And the miners, they said, you know, there is an area over there with gold. We want absolutely the fastest way of having a road over there and a fuel depot over there. Can you take care of it? Absolutely. In a very short time, they come up with a plan where the road is there, equipment is there, and then a fuel depot is there. And they are going in and out with ores. If you can't handle the burden, you are out of the game. They find somebody else. And you are then labeled as incompetent. And media is there to make sure then if you are found incompetent, everybody knows then you are incompetent. Because the world is no longer with the governments, the world is with the freighters. Because they understand if the freighters they get their way, more products go out of the factories, the more they earn. What do they want the government for? Government is always a burden. So it's not the luxury of not having the equipment. It's who's going to have the most numbers of robust, easy fixing equipment, inexpensive, where it can be then sent at a moment's notice. Places over there in Africa, sometimes they don't have even the basics. For instance, road, water. What can you understand? Sometimes you find the miners over there. There is an area over there we want to develop. And then if you speak with the government over there, some of those people are extremely incompetent. They don't understand. They don't have the ability of making decisions. So they would have to trust the miners, and in turn the miners, they trust companies with know-how, with a stock of equipment, where then in an instant they can be placed in a ship, send it over, unload, and get the job done. And then obviously shipment of computers, and then generators, and they are online. And more parcels coming, and more trucks coming, and more ships coming, and more aircrafts coming. And then the government is going to be found then as this animal on a road at night with a high beam on the face. So what would we expect from this time? We expect the Soviet equipment everywhere in the world. How do we know? Because the Antonov aircrafts, they are very famous in Africa. Their tanks, very famous in Africa. AK-47s, always popular in Africa. As far as mining in Africa, would you have an idea? What kind of equipment would they purchase? Then we understand the kingdom of the north and kingdom of the south. Even if you don't believe the scripture, only believe what the Messiah said. The flayers are going to be in charge. It speaks so high, where then if you are not prepared, you're going to be out of the game. Much more so if you're not charging taxes. How are you going to pay your people? You can print out more money so much than if the system halts, because the system itself of the government is going to be linked with the Chinese system. But if they do so, because of the production of their countries, but then if their expenses goes higher than what they are earning, then the system halts. And you can't print more money, because the reason, if you print more money, those earning the money, they take the money and they send in the system, and then the money is gone. It does not return. That's why some countries, such as our country, always printing money and never returning. It ruins the system. So then, let's be wise and do what the Messiah told us to do. The first objective is then charge taxes. Making a deal with the transporters, freighters, when they print the label, either of the container or per box. Taxes must be charged instantly. Then each government, they have a big, huge computer tower over there with those numbers. Taxes of everywhere whatsoever box come to their country. Then they have another computer always making control of the expenses. Then you have to read those numbers and balance your budget. It has to be done very cautiously, because if the expenses then they are more than what you earn, and then the system halts. What the Messiah says is extremely serious. He's not writing to kids to play around with, those junky magazines. The kids, they play around with church and junk. So then let's be watchful, because what the Messiah said is true.